Welcome to Click for IB Biology. Here we're starting our study of natural selection, the mechanism of evolution, and we're looking at the concept of the genetic variation within a population upon which the mechanism of natural selection will operate. There's a blank version of this presentation, a PDF, down in the description below, and there you'll also find 10 questions with the answers that you can use to check your understanding and check your progress. The population variation, and here we're referring really to the phenotype, the phenotypic variation of a population, has two sources. There is the variation due to different genotypes, VG in this case, and also the environment that they experience, here VE. Now we're largely going to leave the environmental variation to one side for a moment, and the reason for that is that this component is not inherited. So changes to a phenotype which are attributable to the environment in which they have been functioning, so we would call that phenotypic plasticity, are not inherited. So what is inherited, of course, are the genes. Now, the genes themselves fall into three categories. There are those genes which operate on the basis of dominance. So within a population, there are different alleles, and they will be operating one of the dominant systems. So you'll have studied genetics. You may know about complete dominance, incomplete dominance, and codominance, multiple alleles, and so forth. Perhaps it would be worth reviewing those types of differences in a population. You will also have studied polygenic inheritance and come across the idea of additive alleles. This is particularly for those polygenic characteristics, such as those showing continuous variation like color, height, and so forth. Then, of course, we have studied the ways in which genes interact with each other, and these are called the epistatic interactions, designated here as VI. So these are the three kinds of source of genetic difference within a population, and these are subject to inheritance. They are passed from one generation to the next, and they are subject to the forces of natural selection. Let's take a more detailed review of genetic variation. So genetic variation within a population could be due to changes in chromosomes or changes in genes. Chromosome mutations are things such as where the chromosomes break and join together again. These are known as translocations and inversions. Translocation is where a chromosome breaks off, a piece of a chromosome breaks off and it joins onto another chromosome, whereas an inversion is where a chromosome breaks, it reverses its sequence and joins back to the same chromosome. Alternatively, there are those conditions, changes to chromosome number, known as aneuploidy. Perhaps the most common one you'll have come across are the trisomies, where we have multiple copies of chromosomes, such as trisomy 21 associated with Down syndrome. And then there's another form, which is very common in plants actually, which is called polyploidy, a mistake of meiosis in which we end up with multiple sets of chromosomes. So that's big changes to the genome. The genetic changes, the gene mutations that we might have come across in our study, of course, are the single nucleotide polymorphisms, where we saw examples of substitution of a base or the deletion of a base, and the way in which that could change the genetic code and lead to changes in the protein produced as a consequence of the expression of that code, and how they may alter the function of the gene, giving us different alleles. There's a more dramatic version of this, which is called frame shifting, usually in which the deletion of a base leads to a complete rewriting and reading of the code, often with drastic effects known as frame shifting. So other sources of genetic variation, other than changing chromosomes or the genes, are the influence of the environment on the expressions of genes. Here we've already studied the methylation of DNA, the methylation of histones. Some of those changes are transgenerational, that is to say that it's possible to inherit them from one generation to the other, to the next rather. Another phenomena which we will cover when we're doing reproduction is sex inactivation. Knowing that females are XX, what happens is that in some cells this X will be deactivated, whereas in other cells this X would be deactivated, and as a consequence, rather than acting with the two alleles per gene, only one of those alleles is operational, and this leads to variation in itself. Of course, sexual reproduction is responsible for the creation of a great deal of the genetic variation. When we have studied inheritance genetics, we will have come across in meiosis the segregation of alleles, and that's where our genotype is big A, little a, and we separate this one this way and this one this way in meiosis, and this perhaps you recall as Mendel's first law, the segregation of alleles. So that creates variation in our gametes. We also came across how, if we move on to look at dihybrid genetics and beyond, where we have the independent assortment. So if we have big A, little a on one homologous pair, big B, little b on another homologous pair, the way that these separate into the gametes is independent of the way that other homologous pairs separate. And so this again creates even greater genetic variation in our gametes, which actually can be calculated at 2 to the power n, where n is the haploid number of chromosomes. Now, meiosis creates a tremendous amount of variation by this way alone, but then that is further increased by the phenomena of crossover, which we have studied in detail in the way in which homologous pairs can actually swap alleles along their chromosomes. So that's another source of tremendous amount of variation from crossover. And then, of course, finally, the greatest production of genetic variation is also due to the random fertilization of one gamete by another. It's often expressed as 2 to the power 2n, in which 2n equals the diploid number, creating this extraordinary number of possibilities of genetic variation in the offspring. So all of these factors together operate for populations of sexually reproducing individuals. Of course, if you're a non-sexually reproducing, asexual, then of course we're pretty much limited to the genetic mutations. However, when combined together, we get tremendous variation in the gametes. And this variation often is seen in a number of distinctive patterns. We often get distinct classes or categories of genetic variations like this and this. Perhaps the best known cases that we came across this were blood groups, where we would have blood group A and blood group B. We would have to extend this to include blood group AB and blood group O. So we would have 4 distinct phenotypic classes, which is an example of discontinuous variation. Now, where we had multiple genes in the polygenic effects, then we ended up with many more genetic classes, a development of this here towards this condition here. And then, as you can see, we end up with the more genes that we have contributing to the characteristic, to the phenotype, then the greater are the number of phenotypic classes that we would have. Now, both of these are subject to environmental impacts, which would tend to smooth out the variation. So if we take the original 2 genotypic classes here, once we add in the environmental effect, the phenotypic variation would tend to smooth out these distinct categories, leading to these kinds of patterns, this kind of bimodal distribution of characteristics that we would have here. And of course, when added to the genetic variation of a polygenic condition, this would smooth out the environmental variation, smooths out the curve to lead to this very distinct feature, which we call continuous variation. So in summary, the genetic variation, remember, is that the word variation is differences, and therefore we must be talking about a population. Remember that it's only the genetic variation which is actually heritable, that can be inherited, not the phenotypic, the parts of the phenotype which are controlled by the environment. So only the genetic component is inherited. And that for an individual's phenotype, it is only their genotype which is passed on to the next generation, not the environmental part, with the possible exception of the way in which epistatic mechanisms can influence the expression of genes. And so this sets us up for the genetic variation, which is the first consideration when thinking about the mechanism of natural selection. And in our next video, we will look at the mechanism of natural selection as first formulated by Darwin, and then we will go on in our playlist to look at other aspects of the mechanism of natural selection and indeed sexual selection.